I hope you like my pretty pictures. I'm a big believer that God has ordained the universe in such a way that everything in the natural world points beyond itself to spiritual truth for those who have the eyes to see. And so I'm leveraging nature for worship and glory. That's what I love to do. But that's not what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about a topic that would at first blush seem to be very, very depressing. In fact, at some point, you might succumb to paroxysms of despair. But I want to give you the word that I'm an optimist about how things end. I'm a big believer that the kingdom of God will survive all machinations, all spiritual warfare, and that I have such a robust confidence in the sovereignty of our God that ultimately we can have a point of view, a perspective that gives us a sense of hope in such a way that we can live in faith and hope and love, even in tumultuous times. And that's what I'm going to want us to go to. But I think, like the men of Issachar, we need to understand our culture. We need to understand our times. And we need to know what we need to do. So we need to know our culture, and we need to know our calling. And if we embed our calling in our culture, we will be wise, and we will use our time as sojourners and pilgrims and strangers and aliens in this world. We'll use our time wisely and well and invest them in the things of the kingdom, and that will honor and please the living God. Now, we're going to be talking then about the decline of nations, and I'm going to be doing a 10-point comparison, effectively, between the Roman Empire and the United States. And it'll be something that I hope will be illuminating to us. We know these things, but it's helpful for us to kind of back off, put the pieces of the puzzle together, and synthesize it. Because when you put these things together, you begin to see, I hope, a coherent pattern, a movement, a direction. And I'm not going to be alarmist. I'm going to just try to contextualize where we are in the various patterns that we see, and try to see where we might head, but how we can live in a way that's going to be pleasing to God. Now, English historian Arnold Toynbee had published his study of history and identified some 26 distinct civilizations, of which only 6 remain today. In the 20th century, we've seen such civilizations or empires such as the Soviet Union, the German Reich, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Italian Empire of Mussolini, the Japanese Empire of Hirohito, and the British Empire, and others as well. We've seen them come, we see them go, and we ask the question of what is it that causes these kingdoms to come and to go. And even the mighty Roman Empire, as we're going to be seeing, I'm going to be claiming that the United States has more in common with Rome than any nation that has existed since the fall of that empire. And it's significant when it's, quote, officially fell, it had already succumbed to moral decay and to cultural decay and to spiritual decay. So it became such that it was imploding from within. Now, there are various approaches to decline, and one approach that has been taken that at least makes sense to me, and I'm not saying that this is always the case with nations, but it seems apropos to our own particular country, that you often start in a context of bondage, as we did, and I'm going to try to pull that back later tonight and see where we might fit in these regards. Spiritual faith followed by a sense of courage. In our own country, there was a time of liberty, moving from that into affluence, complacency, apathy, and then greater dependence. And that kind of dependence can lead us back to bondage. And I'll comment more about that a little bit later. But essentially, I want to speak about the fact that cultures, that civilizations arise from religion, that there is some kind of coherent perspective, or at least a worldview that's designed, whether in India or China or Palestine or Greece or Carthage or Africa, wherever we are, that they have some kind of a religious foundation, even in the former Soviet Union. There was a combination of atheism and state socialism that led to a kind of official religion, because you need a cult. And the roots of culture come from that idea, those beliefs is a cult from which we get the word culture. In Egypt, for example, the worship of nature, of the various gods and goddesses, was such that they personified various values of love and so forth, and as well as pride and courage and industry and deceit and treachery. But we see that as well in Greece and Rome, there was a tremendous worshiping of a pantheon of pagan deities, and they were indeed very religious people as it went. That these kinds of qualities of virtue and love and courage and industry, etc., in which the spirit of these various beings was presumably residing in those qualities, or maybe they were projections of us, or whatever they might have been. These are things that at least provided some kind of a context, a shared worldview that people had. Now, looking to the history of Rome itself, from its rise in about 753 BC to its fall in 476 AD, we can divide its timeline into three basic periods. There's the period of the Second Kings, and then there was the Republic, known for a number of illustrious figures, like Julius Caesar and Pompey before him, and then there came the age of the Empire, and this began with the reign of Caesar Augustus, who was reigning at the birth of Christ. And so we can see then 13 dramatic centuries that took place with over 250 rulers. This image we have, of course, is of Romulus, and it's a sculpture of him and his twin brother Remus, who legend said nourished the twins from their youth with this she-wolf. And he was the first of the 7 kings. And then others included, for example, Tarquinius Priscus, but the monarchy was overthrown in 509 BC. And then Rome became a republic. And its democracy, however, was always something of a cosmetic. Some key figures during that republic included Pompey and Caesar, but then with Augustus in 27 BC to AD 14, what you now have is the movement into absolute power being placed into the hands of the emperor. Emperors Tiberius, who followed, and Caligula followed somewhat after that, a little after that. Nero, under whom, for example, Paul was writing, and ultimately he would be beheaded. These were rulers who had tremendous power and who were really lifted up and deified as personified gods. Now, ultimately, Rome then moved into another period of time, and with Constantine, some things really changed, because he made Christianity the state religion of Rome, and ultimately then that had a tremendous impact on the church itself, insofar as it became now the religion of the people, or the popular religion, so that power and wealth became associated with Christianity, which was in many ways an awful kind of experience. The church was doing a lot better when it was being persecuted in terms of a spiritual sense. You well know that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and where the church becomes the accepted norm, there can be a loss of spiritual vitality, of power, of commitment, and indeed a growth of compartmentalization, where people have two sets of rules by which they try to play. At any rate, after Constantine, Rome was initially sacked in the year 410, but then in 476, Romulus, Augustulus, who was the last of the emperors, he was deposed by a German warrior. And this marked the official fall of the Roman Empire. But they had, in 146 BC, conquered Greece, and indeed in the year 70 was the fall of Jerusalem. And then they themselves then reached up to the point of 476, though their fall and their corruption had happened much before that. Ancient Rome was a powerful culture. It was exceedingly wealthy. It was sophisticated. It was technologically advanced. Its citizens enjoyed remarkable buildings and many creature comforts. Tremendous quality of life for those who had the wealth to enjoy it. And the scale model that you can see, which is on display at the Museum of the City of Rome, illustrates a city that had such architectural beauty and splendor that it would rival any city in the world, even today in many ways, that the majority of the population of Rome really enjoyed a remarkably high standard of living 2,000 years ago. Life in Rome was indeed sophisticated, and by the time of the Apostle Paul, Rome was the greatest city in the world, with over 1 million inhabitants. There was one inscription that suggested there might have been 4 million. As we know, the majority of the people were slaves, and there was a combination of opulence and of squalor that both existed in the imperial city. We can see from these kinds of drawings, partly inspired as well by Pompeii, in which much of what we know about Roman life in details, we know from the remains of Pompeii, because in the year 79 AD, it was buried in volcanic ash as Mount Vesuvius erupted. And when it was discovered and excavated beginning in 1961, all kinds of new things came to light. And it really enhanced our understanding of what it was like to live in Rome. This particular cubiculum, which is a bedroom of a villa of a wealthy man, has an illustration of what the streets of Rome would have looked like. This Roman villa is actually quite beautiful if you can try to use your mind's eye and try to think about how spacious and tasteful, and imagine that it in fact was filled with furniture and the decorations. You really have an extraordinary quality and style of life that people enjoyed. And this was, of course, a villa that was destroyed in Pompeii, but it's so well preserved. The baths of Diocletian, again, illustrate the fact that there was tremendous wealth and tremendous luxury in Rome, because the public baths were not just places to keep clean, but everything seemed to be transacted there. You had bars and libraries and barber shops. Oh, you had brothels, sports facilities, a little bit of everything. And it was a kind of a center of life, and that's why I stuck in a Starbucks, because if Starbucks were around then, that's probably where they would have put it, right there in the baths of Diocletian. At any rate, Nero's palace, just extraordinary precious materials, colorful Italian marbles, and enjoyed splendid woods and pastures and lakes. It was a place of astounding opulence, astounding beauty. Rome as well was a world ruler, because Rome had a tremendous lifestyle and a tremendous power and tremendous assets. But it was also the dominating power in the world. And this Italian map shows in light orange the territories that were governed by Rome at the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. And then also in the light pink, it represents the maximum extent that Rome reached in the year 117. And that they virtually controlled all of Europe, even including Britain, as far as Hadrian's Wall, and then all of northern Africa, including Egypt and most of the Middle East. So it was extraordinary. Furthermore, it had absolute military supremacy. The world had never seen that kind of power. If you ever saw the movie Gladiator, how many of you saw the movie Gladiator? I'm just curious. It's one of the movies, I teach movies, and it's one of the ones I teach. And you might remember at the very beginning, the battle scene. It gives the best description or illustration of the kind of technological prowess that really did exist at that time, that it was stunning. And they were unique in terms of their power, their order, their organization, and their strategies as well. The best trained, the best financed, the best equipped of any military in the world. And I would say that our own military can be compared to that of ancient Rome, because we see as well the world's undisputed supreme military power can be seen as well in our own country when we consider our military supremacy, that it's undisputed both in the sea and in the air, in land and in space. It's quite extraordinary. It's, as we look at the various features that we have in our military as an undisputed world leader, for example, in the sea, only country to possess supercarriers, which are much larger than aircraft carriers of other countries. They travel in battle or strike groups that are ringed by guided missile carriers and destroyers and nuclear attack submarines. Again, the kind of power that the world has never seen before. The naval superiority extends as well to an extraordinary naval fleet and attack submarines that could sink a threatening opposition in just a matter of minutes. And so we see, again, tremendous superiority, such that the world's nations have really had to concede the seas to America. The same is true in the air. And it leads the world in air superiority with more advanced fighters and bombers than those of all the other nations combined. It possesses four stealth aircraft now, the B-18 and B-2 bombers, the F-117A fighter, and the new F-22 Raptor fighter. There he goes. With one more, and that's the F-35, which is on its way. It just constantly upping the ante of the power and the technological prowess. Superiority is also illustrated in the fact that we have tanker fleets in such a way that we can now extend the range of bombers anywhere in the world. And no other nation has the equivalent of the AWACS plane, which provides radar images from the skies, or the new JSTARS plane, which provides detailed radar images to the ground. As well, you have the B-2B Spirit stealth bomber with long-range bombers like the B-1B Lancer, in combination with highly advanced ground-air missiles. And really, in terms of technology, it follows no one. When we think about ground superiority, in addition to the sea and to the air, again, we see that it has the world's strongest armored ground force, approximately 9,000 M1 Abrams tanks. It, again, has something that is unparalleled, that the world has never seen this kind of military power. Space superiority as well, with the wideband global SATCOM satellite, so that you have more and better reconnaissance satellites than all the rest of the world combined. And this is going to just continue to grow. It has the second largest space budget in the world, the Air Force, second only to NASA. So we have other forms of superiority, electronic superiority, that can in fact empower us to use relatively low-cost weapons and to be very effective, like these remote piloted drone fighter planes. That no other nation, again, has the kind of electronics and data management technology as these prospective weapons. The most advanced military as well, and the best trained military in the world, the most experienced and sophisticated military in the world. And so for all practical purposes, then, we could say that the global arms race has really ended with the United States so far ahead that really few other nations could attempt to be a rival. And a historically unparalleled level of power, and nuclear deterrence alone remains as an external threat to our peace and safety. That's effectively what we're seeing. In this comment by Charles Krauthammer, he said, "No country has been as dominant as America culturally, economically, technologically, and militarily in the history of the world since the Roman Empire." And I have to agree with that. I think that's an accurate statement. Now that we've established how remarkably, really, in some ways, similar the United States is to ancient Rome in terms of culture and economics and technology and the military area, that is to say, in terms of a variety of strengths, let's consider some of the areas of weakness, because there are a lot of parallels there as well. And so I want to explore 10 symptoms of decline I read a book some years ago by Jim Nelson Black called When Nations Die, and he used this outline that I'm going to be presenting to you tonight. Symptoms that relate, first of all, to social decay. And these would include the crisis of lawlessness, the loss of economic discipline, and a rising bureaucracy. The next area of decline would be cultural decay. And as we can see here, you'd have the decline of education, and you have weakening cultural foundations, loss of respect for tradition, and increase in materialism. These are all things that we can see in Rome, and I'm going to draw some comparisons with Rome and the United States in each of these 10 areas in our times this evening. And then tomorrow morning, Oz will be giving you 2 sessions that I'm looking forward to hearing, and then he and I will have a concluding session, and I'm going to do just a short presentation to look at the positive side. That is to say, I'm going to try to end up on a positive note, a note that builds up a sense of confidence in the working of God and how we ought to live in the kinds of times in which we find ourselves. The other symptoms of decline are concerning moral decay, and there we have a rise in immorality and a decay of religious belief as well as a devaluing of human life. So let's explore some of these symptoms of decline in our time together. I go back to Alexis de Tocqueville, who captured this idea very well of what we're going to be discussing in his Democracy in America. He observed, because Roman civilization perished through barbarian invasions, we are perhaps too much inclined to think that this is the only way a civilization can die. If the lights that guide us ever go out, they will fade little by little as if of their own accord. We therefore should not console ourselves by thinking that the barbarians are still a long way off. Some peoples may let the torch be snatched from their hands, but others stamp it out themselves. So the question is whether we've been committing cultural suicide and making ourselves increasingly vulnerable to the barbarians, to outside forces, in a way that might be, in fact, some way similar to Rome. And that's where we're going to be exploring. So let's look at these 10. And I want to just unpack each of them very, very briefly, and begin with the crisis of lawlessness. Now, ancient Rome failed to restrict murder. Instead, it licensed and encouraged it. Gladiatorial games, abortion, suicide, and so forth. It became increasingly lawless, and ancient Rome as well really pursued all kinds of sexual deviance and became increasingly defiant of the standards of decency. And so Greece's devolution as well was a result of their own corruption within and made them vulnerable to Roman conquest in 146 BC. And it was a bit ironic because once they were placed under military authority under Rome, they were then restored to order, and they brought back the rule of the law, and yet Rome failed to practice what it preached. In other words, it was a distinct double standard. They'd imposed this on them, but they themselves were declining in terms of their own laws. Carthage similarly was defeated by Rome. And the Phoenician state of Carthage, which was midway across the north coast of Africa, was brought to its knees by lawlessness and by anarchy and so forth. And as a result, this great trading empire that in many ways was even more powerful for a season than Rome, sunk really into greed and decadence, mercenary forces, and eventually people who became increasingly desirous of rebellion, foreigners brought in and so forth, a loss of a united culture. And it led to a culture that was was finally taken over by Rome. And really few remains are found in ancient Carthage. Some Punic cemeteries and also some shrines and so forth, but they too were defeated by Rome, and again Rome put them under the Pax Romanum, the Roman law, Roman justice, but they themselves began to decline from within. Now, in America, we can see certain very real parallels, and the United States, like Rome, can suffer from the growth of lawlessness. According to this time clock that's published in the FBI's website, latest statistics show that one violent crime now is taking place every 22 seconds. And this consists of a murder every 31 minutes, forcible rape every 6 minutes, robbery, aggravated assaults, very, very quick indeed, very, very rapid. And indeed, as well, property crimes are on the increase. In fact, when we put this together, this presentation back in 2005, these numbers were substantially less than they are now. So a lot of these numbers have actually gone up. And when we consider, for example, homicides per 100,000 population, it's a violent industrialized nation in terms of homicides and violent crime. And again, we average something on the order of 20,000 to 25,000 murders and non-negligent manslaughters per year. Now, the average homicides for other nations that are industrialized are very interesting to me because, for example, in Japan, about 1/2 per 100,000, 1.2 in Germany, 1.3 in Italy, the UK 1.4, 1.7 in France, 4.3 in America. There's a remarkable difference that you can see in our culture. And I haven't even mentioned that it's far and away the highest incidence among the same countries of property crime, burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, and so forth. So you certainly have a culture that has been measurably declining in terms of lawlessness. As to the second of these criteria, that is to say social decay, there's been a loss of economic discipline. Now, going back to Rome for a moment, we can see that Rome's economy really flowered during the time of Augustus Caesar from 27 BC to the year to AD 14, and yet within 500 years the empire would collapse. And what were the key causes of this collapse? One suggestion is that imperial overstretch had a lot to do with it. This is when the sum total of the nation's global interests and obligations outstrips the country's ability to protect and defend them all simultaneously. We've seen this before, and I believe we're seeing the process now. This is a huge risk, which has led to the fall of various powers. And a second key cause of this kind of economic collapse is excessive taxation. And the taxation in Rome was so oppressive in the latter years of the empire that wealthy landowners tried to flee into barbarian territories to avoid the long arm of the Roman law. Now, when you look at our own situation, and it fascinates me, the process of looking at national debt, and the national debt clock is just plain depressing to me in Times Square. It's a great place to have it. And they just recently had to modify it because they needed to add another digit. You see, because now we're up to over 10 trillion, and this new digit here just illustrates. Again, when Bill and I put this together, it was about 7.5 trillion, and it continues to rise. And I'm not even talking about consumer debt, which is at an all-time high as well. It's absolutely gone up almost exponentially in terms of consumer debt. As a share of personal income, household debt has risen to 85%, which is also quite a record. And not to mention bankruptcies, which once again are on the rise. And so this is going to really all combine together to form a tremendous instability. And as you perhaps have noticed of late, a loss of consumer confidence. Maybe you've noticed this a little bit in our time. And looking at the market, which was something on the order of over 14,000 on the Dow, and now about 7,500. Maybe it's rallied a little bit, but bottom line here is it's, in fact, the real question is, what's the bottom? And we have yet to see what that might look like, but that's another matter. So when we consider this whole idea of financial net worth, that's the thing you want to look at. What is our net worth, both as a country, or as individuals and so forth, as communities, that government debt in recent decades, it's really refused to live within its means. And this is the issue that I think we deal with. Ultimately, no business, no household would survive if you used that kind of approach, that you just continue to over-leverage yourself. It's equivalent to some people that I have known who try to pay off one credit card with another credit card, and then they roll that on to another credit. You can only play that game so long, and then it all comes upon you and just crumbles. Cicero was right in the 1st century BC when he said that the budget should be balanced, the treasury should be refilled, the public debt should be reduced, and the arrogance of public officials should be controlled. I would call that a very relevant and timely quote. You see, things in some ways haven't changed a whole lot in that regard. Now, the source of the following quotation is somewhat disputed, but I think that the truth is nevertheless evident. A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. And from that moment on, the majority will vote for the candidate promising the most benefits from the treasury. And ultimately, if you stop and think about this, the real bottom line force and stability of a democracy has to do with a spiritual vision, has to do with basically a moral consensus that's inspired by a spiritual consensus. And that is an unstable compound. And we begin to discover that a democracy can erode. It's not going to necessarily continue on. We see a third of these social decay indices, and that would be rising bureaucracy. Now, when we think about Roman government, it really went out of control, especially around the time of the Emperor Diocletian. The Roman Empire was about 1,000 years old when Diocletian came to power in 284 AD. And power was concentrated in the emperor and his personal council. But the Romans never really developed a practical form of representative government in which the capacity to deal with complexities of such a huge and vast regime could be dealt with. And so the bureaucracy grew so large that at one point there were more people in the government payroll than there were taxpayers to support them. Now that's really depressing. And that there was also a tremendous drop in productivity, which was coupled by burdensome government kinds of regulations, bad national policies, and so forth. And it really made every form of trade and farming and manufacturing and even common labor increasingly unprofitable. So this was a problem as well. Emperors, aided by the Senate, preyed on the wealth even of the prominent Roman families in an attempt to pay the army and feed the growing hordes of the starving peasants. The industrious classes upon whom the empire depended were driven into poverty and exile. And so the tax base declined. And this became a real problem, with corrupt officials only exacerbating the problem by confiscating wealth, and reached a point where there was actually over 50% unemployment. And so this was really something that was completely out of control. Now, if we draw, and this was why we went to the bread and circuses strategy. You know, in large cities in every province, they needed to have a form of bribery because people had to be fed and amused to prevent violent outbursts, among other things. You see, you give them bread and circuses and so forth. Large quantities of food were distributed. Gladiatorial games were created for the masses and so forth. And so this was a real growing problem that increased the decadence of Rome and led to its ultimate demise. And in our own situation, we look at the size of our government, which fascinates me because back in 1935, there were some 600,000 federal employees, and in 1999, almost 17 million. And what we see here is this. Though what you have is that rate went up 28-fold when the population has only slightly more than doubled. So it illustrates, again, a tremendous shift. Out of control largesse results, I think, in dwarfing the interests of a community. and as well in consuming the productivity of a nation. And so when this kind of thing occurs, then, when it's out of control, then it leads to a real problem of bureaucracy. A fourth component that I can compare is a decline of education. And indeed, there has been a loss of education in Rome that was characterized by a movement, a particular trend that toward rhetoric and debate and away from history and literature. It's interesting that that took place because rhetoric and debate related to the more lucrative and expeditious professions of such that lawyers and politicians and bureaucrats could be successful in those areas. And it was a loss of essential knowledge that was beginning to take place in the populace, as well as a sense of history, and a general deterioration that Rome experienced in an overall quality of education. And then to make matters worse, there was also a kind of government-enforced thought police, and Nero was particularly good at ferreting out and dissent and punishing people who were opponents. In our own situation, we can see a parallel. I call it dumbed down America. Illiterate, right for free help. That's kind of, I don't know what to make of that sign. Here's welcome back. Hope you had a good break. If you can, that's scary. I can only hope that it was a joke. I can, HADE and BRAKE, but maybe it's not a joke. Indeed, SAT scores or SAT scores are still below their 70 levels. There's been some rise, but still way below. They have improved a bit since 82, but they're below those rate levels. And at the same time, our scores for U.S. Students really still fail to score among the top nations. And that's another index of a problem of our educational systems. When college graduates know slightly less than high school grads in 1955 in the crucial areas of literature, music, science, geography, and history. I find that to be fascinating as well. There's a loss of connection with the past. There has been a diminishment of connection, of knowledge, and people now being more ignorant than really ever before on the history of our country and a variety of things that are fundamental issues of knowledge that have led to, in fact, greatness in culture. Now, there have been a number of movements that are creating values-neutral thinking and promoting a worldview that everything except Christianity ought to be tolerated, including sexual deviance, abortion rights, and animal rights. It's interesting that Christianity can always be attacked with impunity. There's always an open season on Christianity. But if you've tried to use the same kind of vilification on any other ideology, there would be some serious consequences to that. At any rate, this growth here is coupled as well by a kind of deconstructionism, where students in history classes are taught a history that's been rewritten or perhaps filtered through a more postmodern interpretation. And today's students now learn the view that there are really no absolutes, no sources of ultimate meaning and truth, and that all, quote, values are of equal importance. Notice the change from the word virtue to value. One is objective and one is subjective. The change as well from character to personality. Again, one is objective and one is subjective. There's been a diminishment. People have become increasingly skilled, however, in a variety of disciplines, including impression management. We're very good at managing impressions and creating illusions. That's why Agassi's thing, image is everything. Remember the commercial? It's kind of a scary thing when image trumps substance. At any rate, we are, though, producing some interesting illiterates insofar as we have replaced the 3 R's with the 3 S's: sensitivity, self-esteem, and safe sex, which is always nice. Politically correct education can be really regarded as a form of thought control by self-approved or self-appointed clerics to remove restraints of traditional values and of Christianity, And so really what happens in the product of relativism is a kind of process of relativistic philosophy that teaches essentially that there is no real character, value, so character can wither, character can begin to die. Because a nation and also the people are reduced to growing selfishness and expediency for the sake of short-term forms of pleasure. And also, the shift in philosophy can rob individuals of a real sense, a real foundation for hope, or for meaning, or for purpose in life. And this can breed a host of ills: suicide and alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, murder, and so forth. These are products as well of this cultural decay. Now, weakening cultural foundations. So the social decay was caused by the increase in lawlessness and the loss of economic discipline and rising governmental bureaucracy. And the cultural decay was triggered by loss of education. And all these things work together in a synergistic way so that we have destruction from within. Again, going back to Rome, both Greece and Rome really gave in to greed, to growing forms of corruption, and indeed moral degeneracy. And these kinds of processes really led to a loss of a raison d'etre. It's really the whole idea of a basis for living in our lives, a reason for being, for a real sense of faith in the system that's lost because neither government nor education, nor the pursuit of personal pleasure can really fill this kind of a void. That what happens is then you begin to get absorbed in self-interest, and education becomes increasingly bankrupt of value and of meaning. One's appetite for personal pleasure can't be satisfied, and immunity to satisfaction from ever greater pleasures. And so this leads to a kind of moral inward degeneracy. And a nation really does not collapse only when it's vanquished by barbarian hordes. Rome really wasted away long before the barbarians arrived. And so the pity for the Goths who claimed Caesar's throne is that it was an empty chair. The glory had long departed. It was Ichabod. The glory was gone. And so that was a destruction from within, not from without. Now, as we consider the health of America, we've seen how Rome began to decay from within and ultimately led to that demise. How is America doing? What kind of objective measures of social and cultural health are available? And when we consider the report, for example, in the Index of Leading Cultural Indicators, to answer this question, we find that there have been substantial and alarming social regression that have been taking place. Now here, specifically, the figures I'll give you are between the early 60s and the early 90s. And we could see at that time, during that period of time, a 966% increase in cohabitation, 523% increase in out-of-wedlock births in those years from the early 60s to the early 90s, about 30 years, 370% increase in violent crime, a 270% increase on children on welfare, 215% increase on single-parent families, 210% increase in teenage suicide, and a 200% increase in the crime rate, as well as a 130% increase in the divorce rate, and then you can add to that a 75-point decrease in the average SAT score. So there have been some improvements in the 90s that took place in terms of violent crime and welfare and teenage suicide, but really the breakdown of the family was a major concern. And this is really the issue that we have to deal with here, because we consider that the out-of-wedlock birth ratio increased 18% from 1990 to 2000. Single-parent families increased 13%, but the marriage rate it decreased 9%, and cohabiting couples increased 48% in that one decade, which was, I think, quite significant. So this follows 3 decades of dramatic, harmful changes in the American family. So we see a variety of things that are challenging the fundamental unit for a culture, for the transmission of values, of character, of a sense of spiritual purpose from one generation to the next that seems to be diminishing. Furthermore, there were some 1,100 children who died of abuse and neglect in 1998, and what you have here is 3.56 children per day dying of child abuse in 2001 now, almost at equal birth rates and abortion rates of unmarried women, 45 per 1,000 for the abortion, 39 per 1,000. So this has become a extreme, there's just nothing really, we've never seen anything like it in our history. As well, we can see that illegal drug use has continued to grow between 1990 and 1999, suicide being the third leading cause of death among persons aged 10 to 20. Motor vehicle accidents and homicide are number 1 and number 2. So again, times have changed in considerable ways. Emotional and behavioral problems tripled from 1996 to 1997 for 4 to 15-year-olds. And AIDS has become the leading cause of death for black males aged 25 to 44. So we see some genuine changes that have been taking place very, very rapidly. The process, in my view, continues to grow. We've also redefined deviancy. What we really have to see is that in increasing crime rates, we see redefinitions in terms of the destruction of the traditional family, the explosion of psychoses and mental disorders. And the way to deal with these problems, in some ways, is to simply not to reform or give moral guidance, but to redefine them, and to define them as normal. And this can really become a serious problem vis-a-vis a moral deconstruction of what is normal. Once you redefine it, then we now have a whole new way of understanding it. It's been said that we may have promoted self-indulgence when we thought we were only endorsing freedom, as James Q. Wilson put it. I don't want to hold that picture up too long. Or this one as well. Sociologist James Wilson observed that we may have promoted self-indulgence when we thought we were only endorsing freedom. And so if we look at this whole process here, if morality is merely relative, it cannot be easily enforced. And if we excuse the most outrageous violations of decency, we shouldn't be surprised then when our nation is turned into urban jungles by the immature and irresponsible behavior of its sons and daughters, as Jim Nelson Black put it. So what we have here is a moral relativism that leads to a form of lawlessness, which leads to anarchy itself. In other words, it's a process we've seen before in many civilizations. It's happened before, and it will continue to happen. The sixth one that I'm going to be looking at, and then we'll take a break after, it's just to give you a sense of relief. You see, you need I hope I'm not overwhelming us here, but loss of respect for tradition is not a trivial thing. In this photograph here, for example, thank God for 9/11. Again, with Rome, there was a disintegration that was caused by a loss of respect for tradition, and a disintegration which occurred with individual struggles, with groups, conflicts, and so forth. Particularly the secular against the religious became an increasing issue of disintegration. Innovators against the tradition-minded. And so there was intense political and social polarization, which would escalate to warfare during the time of the later Roman emperors. Now, in a very real sense, we haven't been immune to division occurring between these factors as well. And certainly the innovators versus the tradition-minded. When we consider, for example, the Enlightenment thinking that eroded traditional values, revolutionary ideas from the French Revolution, when we think of the influence of key figures like Rousseau and Voltaire and Montesquieu and Diderot, we think about the fact that these kinds of values then rejected, these thinkers rejected traditional values, really rejected the vision of the Christian vision that was really the basis for the culture in Europe and attempted to dislodge the restraints of traditional theology. And so these were radical, powerful movements that also influenced us. Now, I was a child of the 60s. Basically, I was a hippie in Berkeley, California in the summer of '67. Don't look that way now, but I was. And I immersed myself in virtually everything except for one thing. I was never really impressed by the political agendas that, so there were some tremendously intriguing things that took place, and there are some things that I'm glad that I experienced. But one of the things I never was impressed with was the naive supposition that we can just replace and tear down the establishment because there was nothing to put in its place. It would have been a formula for anarchy. To abolish all existing standards of merit and authority and judgment was a growing phenomenon. And furthermore, there was a growth in an expectation to overthrow really a Christian standard, a Christian value, to bring about, in some cases, a new and exotic paganism and a kind of a ritualistic communism. In fact, I worked with a commune when I was in seminary. It was a very interesting experience. They'd all been Zen Buddhists. And then they came to faith in Jesus, and so I would go there and work with them. It was quite fascinating how their whole vision was kind of unified around one thing and then changed. And their vision now with Jesus was dramatic, although I always fasted those weekends, because they still cooked macrobiotically, and I couldn't stand the stuff. So they thought I was a very godly man, you see, and that when in actuality I just couldn't. But it was intriguing just to be a part of all that and to see those things occur. But what happened then was a movement then to a flirtation with various Eastern religions and a variety of other things that then moved us into another dimension. And we move into a more postmodern way of seeing it. And so, for example, this particular statement is, it's our world, don't use it, don't try to define it. Above all, don't label us with it, even if we apply it to ourselves, which is always intriguing to me. But the mindset here is, in this particular case, you may have 2 degrees, but I read an article once on Wikipedia. But claims for truth are really seen as linguistic truth constructs that don't really carry independent or objective meaning. And so this has been a genuine change that's occurred here, where all of us begin to have our own truths, in which we say we're all equally valid. And indeed, the claim to a single truth or an appeal to reason and logic are actually regarded to be tools of oppression. You'll see this little sign that says, "Down with meta-narratives." But the problem is they have a meta-narrative that, in fact, is used to denounce other meta-narratives. This is a self-defeating process. You can't get around it. So the question is, for example, how we define tolerance. As I say, tolerance has been redefined, as you know, in our time. Tolerance used to mean that you put up with something, or you agreed to disagree, didn't it? In fact, if I go to a restaurant and someone asks me how did I enjoy it, I say, well, I tolerated it. That's probably not a good endorsement of the restaurant. And we do know zero tolerance, we talk about that, and yet we've really largely defined it to mean embrace. And I want to suggest to you, and this is one of the most important things for us to think through clearly, is that tolerance is, when it comes to truth, is a travesty, but when it comes to people, is a virtue. And so the issue here is this, that I can love a person even when I disagree with their belief and their behavior. Whereas it's now being defined, if you don't agree with my belief and behavior, you can't love me. But here's the thing, they don't agree with my belief and behavior. You see? And so what you have here is they're intolerant of my definition of tolerance. Do you see how that works there? So again, it's a self-defeating system. But postmodernism defeats itself because it actually creates a meta-narrative that says there are no meta-narratives. It's like saying, I can't speak a word in English. And I just did. we'll stop there, and I'm going to finish the next three, and then I want to, as well in our second session together, I want to explore where are we heading as a nation, and what are some ways in which we can at least think for our future. So when we get back together after the break, I want to talk about these remaining components, and then kind of make some explorations together that does that, called Romans. You see, there's a method to this madness here. 'Cause I should also mention, by the way, that on my kenboa.org website, I'm planning to begin adding PDFs of these presentations, as well as making the presentation notes available, so that my associate, Bill Ibsen, where are you, Bill? Bill's in the back there. He's the fellow who has worked with me in creating these terrific, he's the guy who's responsible for the great images and so forth. So, and Bill and I made a decision that I think is really a good one, and that is to share this stuff and just with an open hand. And so what I'm doing is I'm adding hundreds and hundreds of MP3s to my website, and I'm also adding more and more text resources, about 9,000 pages of transcriptions now of a series that I've done on various things. There are two there are two weekly videos that are on there, and they're archived, and these visual presentations, things of that sort. Because my view of the matter is, why not make it a stewardship issue where you can have it and use it? That's my thinking about that. So that's essentially what I want to do. So it'll be there, I hope, very soon. Now we're looking at the seventh one, which is cultural decay, specifically to increasing materialism. So I want to work my way through these, through 10, and then give you some other thoughts. And so we're going to move in the positive direction in just a moment. But the idea of Roman materialism in this villa, it's the Roman poet Livy said, "It's true that when men had fewer possessions, they were also modest in their desires. Lately, riches have brought avarice and abundant pleasures, and the desire to carry luxury and lust to the point of ruin and universal perdition." Again, this has a modern ring to it, some of these kinds of statements. And this is actually a mural from Herculaneum that was destroyed, and of basically a drunken revelry. At any rate, this kind of materialism, how does it start? Well, it denies any reality beyond the realm, really, of immediate experience. Its major focus, then, is much more palpable, much more tangible, and certainly not spiritual. All that matters are possessions, living conditions, physical circumstances, economic welfare. And I'm going to be saying a little bit later that I fear that the body of Christ has succumbed to much of this in ways that have been kind of chilling to me, whereby people have put their hope in things that God never promised and become like a bubble in the back of culture, always a little bit behind the times, but desperately trying to keep current. And so there's been a real loss of that integrity. Well, going back to this then, the mindset there with the materialism in Rome was that there was nothing beyond the here and now. So the results of this materialism then was that all that was not legally prohibited was socially allowed, and that morality will be jettisoned, and was, for the sake of material possessions or personal pleasures. That there was a purpose and meaning to life. It was reduced, though, to growth and pleasure. And this really did produce a tremendous spiritual vacuum. But the point is that the soul of a nation can't survive when greed and lust and selfishness and ambition are the only criteria of value. The fact is that the value of sacrifice, self-sacrifice, is critical in building and sustaining any nation, anywhere, anytime. The idea of being willing to sacrifice one's interests for the sake of others. And when we begin to implode and pull things in ourselves, we lose that capacity. Michael Lewis put it this way, speaking about our own situation and an illustration of our trend or movement toward materialism in our culture. There have been two great changes over the past 40 years in the way Americans shop. One is a gradual shift toward a pattern of consumption that has little to do with the simple satisfaction of needs. Perhaps you've noticed that. Two, the rise of the shopping mall as a place to satisfy this peculiar lack of needs. And it fascinates me. Here's an image, for example, of the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota. It's the nation's largest retail and entertainment complex, and one of the two top tourist destinations in the country, with this indoor roller coaster and theme park. This is in a mall. And it fascinates me because it's become something like an obsession. After the Second World War, there were 8 malls in the country. Between 1970 and 1990, there were 25,000. I haven't really found out what the current figure is 18 years later, but I promise you it's gone up. As well, we consider the house. A house I grew up in had 1 bathroom and a couple of bedrooms, and that was about it. But everyone else had that too. But it's interesting how by 2004, it's more than doubled in its average size, and the natures of what we expect and the amenities we enjoy have increased in extraordinary ways. And so, again, it's not entirely wrong to enjoy good things, but when one becomes obsessed with them, when they define us, when we are willing then to sacrifice quality of life in terms of relationships and other things in order to gain those kinds of things, there's a fundamental problem. The values get distorted, relationships become tenuous, and one's own spiritual commitment can be diminished as well. It's fascinating that children influence as much as 17% of spending on cars and 70% of influence on the spending of food. In fact, many people today recognize the McDonald's Golden Arches more than the Christian cross, and I'm not exaggerating that. If any of you saw the movie Super Size Me, you recall that they actually had these images of Ronald McDonald and some of Jesus. More kids recognize Ronald than they did Jesus, which is quite intriguing in our culture. That was a depressing movie to watch, by the way, but that's another matter. We move into the next area, the rise in immorality. And what do I mean by this? I want to talk about, again, with contrasting Rome and our own situation, or really consider the kinds of parallels that we have experienced. And among other things, there have been widely accepted Roman practices, which included, for example, and are illustrated by these terracotta oil lamps, which were depicting very sexually explicit matters. This is a phallus statue, a giant statue in the Temple of Dionysius. This is an image of a prostitute in a villa, and we also have a painting of a Pompeii brothel. And these kinds of things really illustrated the growth in a wide variety of these kinds of Roman practices, and group sex, bestiality, pedophilia was a huge issue, and it grew as the empire continued. As well, as Polybius put it, for some young men indulged in affairs with boys, others in affairs with courtesans. One might be quite convinced of the decline of the Republic when pretty boys cost more than fields and jars of caviar cost more than a plowman. And this was a huge, huge issue. And we're not even talking here about the kind of entertainment and how it grew bawdier and more bazaars, and all sorts of erotic spectacles of every kind became very, very common in Rome. Besides which, the emperors themselves were wonderful examples of the same kind of decadence. We think of Julius Caesar, for example, and you consider his statue here, but he was referred to as every woman's man and every man's woman. Tiberius made himself a private sporting house where sexual extravagances were practiced for his secret pleasures. And it was absolutely extraordinary what the degradation that he practiced. This is from the Suetonius, the lives of the 12 Caesars describe these things in real detail. Gaius Caligula really had no attention to current fashions in his dress and so forth, and all kinds of corruptions in his own life, and Nero as well. I should mention Nero, that he tried to have a boy who was turned into a girl by castration, and then he went through a wedding ceremony with him, dowry, bridal veil and all, took him to a palace with a great crowd in attendance, and treated him as his wife. As one writer put it, the world would have been a happier place had Nero's father, Domitius, married that sort of wife. But again, are these practices limited only to ancient Rome? And apparently not. This is a web page from America's own NAMBLA, which is the North American Man-Boy Love Association. And the whole idea here is there's numerous growing sites that describe this whole idea of pedophilia in great detail. There's also a tremendous love affair with voyeurism. And where, for example, pornography, $14 billion industry, 98 billion worldwide. These figures bumped up significantly since 2005 when we first did it. We had to revise our figures. Now there are some 2.5 billion porn mails sent every day, some 420 million porn web pages, 28 million new pages added each month. This is quadrupled in the last just few years. It's absolutely phenomenal. And some 100,000 websites offer child porn. And I find in my own ministry, I'm having to deal with people who are addicted to this kind of thing more and more frequently. It's just become a huge epidemic. And this is a thing that can really cause people to lose, to decline, to lose any spiritual and moral aesthetic. In this quote, like the Roman circus, porn appeals to the prurient interests of base human nature through a voyeuristic but detached participation in the turmoil, pain, and private lives of other people. There's even a psychic voyeurism that's not pornographic when you consider the kinds of shows that reveal all the pains of people who've had horrible lives. This was the Jerry Springer complex, and where all these kinds of shows. What the people are doing is they're like being voyeurs on the pain of others, partly because they can feed off that and say, I'm not that bad, I guess. You see, maybe things aren't so bad for me. So this is a process. And we begin to bring back the central debauchery of paganism. Some 60% of all website visits are indeed sexual in nature. Sex now, typed into Google, yields to over 700 million hits, the #1 search, and that increased rapidly in the last 3 years. Some 25 million adults visit porn sites 1 to 10 hours a week. 4.7 million at over 11 hours a week. We're talking about serious addiction that can destroy a person from the inside. 70% of hotel in-room profits come from porn. And the 2 largest purchases of bandwidth are U.S. firms in that industry. So we can see, what's my prediction? It's only going to get worse. I mean, it's actually increased. You could trace it exponentially. And the process continues to become a process whereby people are more and more enslaved, and becomes a process of less and less quality for more and more indulgence. Even American children's video games, when you think about it. Here's a random sample of video game images which were taken from just the first few pages of a 25-plus page website that had images that could be downloaded for computer wallpaper. And when you think about the kinds of games that actually blend both the hyper-powerful streams of violence as well as pornography as child entertainment, then you begin to realize that these are things that now are reaching children at extraordinary times, and indeed affecting them profoundly. There's no way in which you can be involved in these things without that. You might be familiar with Moore's Law. And one of the ways in which America differs from Rome is an exponential growth in technology. And with computers, televisions, cell phones and satellites, the internet, we have the ability now to spread evil at an exceedingly rapid pace, as you can just imagine. And it is growing rapidly. It's just the reality. I'm not a Luddite. I do believe that technology has tremendous value, but what can be used for good can also be used for ill. And of course, that's the perspective I have on all these things. They themselves are not the issue, it's how they're used, this technology. But at any rate, we know that he predicted that the number of transistors per square inch on integrated circuits would double every 2 years since 1965, and they have thus far. And so that has tremendous potential for an exponential growth in evil, because that kind of technology can simply be a carrier that will further promulgate evil, as well as peer-to-peer networking, now offering 24/7, 365 global access for hardcore porn file sharing. And so you have this tremendous network. So it's really, in my view, reached a tremendous volatility and velocity. It's just unprecedented in human history. I think of one of my favorite writers, C.S. Lewis, and I think about his Screwtape Letters. And in this insightful letter, my dear Wormwood, in the first place, I have always found that the trough periods of the human undulation provide excellent opportunity for all sensual temptations, particularly those of sex. He talks about the tough times as well as the good times and so forth. The attack has a much better chance of success when the man's whole inner world is drab and cold and empty. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. And that's exactly what any addictive behavior does. It gives you an ever-increasing craving, but the pleasure diminishes. You become so enslaved by it that it virtually defines you. And this is true in a variety of forms, not just pornographic, but other forms of addictive behavior. Here's a woman wearing a shirt that says, "Thank God I'm an atheist." This symbolizes a decay of religious belief. This statue of Aphrodite, for example, in Rome, going back to the Romans, they really worshiped the gods of the Greeks, and because they did, there was a growth in these pagan temples. By Paul's day, there were some 420 pagan temples in Rome alone. They were very religious people then. And in fact, these little putti at the bottom there illustrate the kind of spiritual connection here with these little angel-like beings. And here's an image of the ruins of the temple of Vesta, which is the goddess of the hearth, which was attended by a cult of 6 Vestal virgins and so forth. And so you genuinely had something that, at least for some period of time, was an ideology, or even though it was a pagan ideology, it still provided some kind of cultural ethos, a cultural connection. That finally evaporated. This is an interesting building. I don't know if many of you have been in the Pantheon in Rome, but I noticed that today when I was in the National Art Gallery that they have a miniature Pantheon when you go inside, including the little oculus. The oculus is this area here, where that's where a natural light can be brought in. Pantheon was a temple for all gods. And so really Rome was a worshiping culture, but it didn't appreciate all faith. As is tested by Augustine in the early part of the 5th century, who said that Romans despised Christians because they really opposed their unrestrained sexual lifestyles. And Tertullian wrote in his apology that the Romans so despised the Christians that they hated the name Christian. And one finds similar hatred directed toward believers today. And so this whole process here in Rome is illustrated in our time as well. It's fascinating to me that in a 2003 Barna poll, where he reported that more than 4 out of 5 adults, 83%, contended that they were concerned about the moral condition of the nation. And given that 84% of adults consider themselves to be at least believers in Jesus, they have good reason to worry about the moral state of the country. But you consider what the average American actually came up with here, where they believed it was morally acceptable for cohabitation, bearing in mind again that such a high percentage of the population professed to be Christians, that you had sexual fantasies. 59% thought there was no problem with that, 45% no problem with abortion, and the same would be true, a huge number relative to former times, of adultery or fornication, which were acceptable, pornography. And I predict, and drunkenness and so forth, I predict that these kinds of figures will only increase in the years ahead. It's predictable. I mean, it's not really, you don't have to be a genius to see that there are trends that have increased and will continue to increase. And so that you see these results here, and yet it's fascinating to me with our own decline in religion, though there are so many people who profess, it seems that a small number possess. And Barna states that the number of unchurched adults in the United States has doubled since 1991. That's a very significant number. And while a substantial majority, approximately 84%, as I said, identify themselves, quote, as quote, Christians, the statistics are confusing. You see, only 45% say they know the teachings of Christianity very well, but 12% of Christians believe that Noah's wife was Joan of Arc. I'm not making this up. I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal. And what's significant is, with so many so-called believers, 56% say that a person can earn their way into heaven, which is totally inimical to the whole Christian vision and to the gospel. It's fascinating. And while Christianity is being watered down, its opposition also can heat up, regardless of an inherent contradiction that this creates. Charles Sykes puts it this way: given the dangers young blacks face in the nation's inner city, illiteracy, drugs, gang violence, few black parents lose much sleep worrying that their children will be exposed to prayer. The educrats, however, worry about it for them. Repeat after me: a crucifix submerged in urine is art. A crucifix in a classroom is a threat to our constitutional freedom. This is an image by this Saranto Andres in 1987. This was his artwork, so-called, called Piss Christ, where what he did is he put a crucifix in urine and called that art. Now try having Piss Muhammad, you see, or try having that with Piss, even with Moses or whatever, any other group. There would be it would be a tremendous vilification of this. But because it was Christianity, it was almost regarded as being prophetic, heroic, and so forth, which fascinates me. Again, it's open season specifically for followers of Jesus. But any other ideology, if you tried the same tactics, there'd be an outrage. At any rate, Will Durant, I think, was right when he said, there is no significant example in history before our time of a society successfully maintaining moral life without the aid of religion. And though he wasn't really a follower of Jesus, he rightly understood that religion, some spiritual basis, was the foundation for a moral consensus, a moral life, and that moral life then was necessary to sustain a culture, a civilization. And my final of these 10 is the devaluing of human life. Now, this, again, is an issue that we certainly could see in Rome. This particular medieval illustration of infanticide in Rome just shows, as they put it in the 12 tables of the Roman law, Cicero, citing them, said, deformed infants shall be killed. Seneca, we drown children who at birth are weakly and abnormal. And so we see then this was a process that was culturally acceptable, and that this whole process proliferated with Roman abortion, for example, in a variety of ways. It proliferated not because of poverty, but because of adulterous sex and the desire to be childless, which was a large component of what was happening then. And furthermore, the emperors themselves modeled a cheap view of life. A chaste wife was regarded at that time almost to be non-existent because of the rampant adultery in these areas. At any rate, emperors had no qualms about taking life, whether young or old or prenatal or postnatal. It didn't matter that much, and you could see again illustrated in the lives of these Caesars. Such was the low view of life in Rome, that infanticide, child abandonment, abortion, these were all normal phenomena. In fact, with specifically this, it's interesting that the philosophers Aristotle and Plato actually condoned it, in fact promoted that, because they felt that the society had to be limited in the population. Suicide, human sacrifice, all these were phenomena that were quite characteristic of Rome in its time of degeneration. And so you had this process here, and indeed concerning death, concerning this whole process, from 27 BC to the year AD 324, only 13 out of the 50 emperors who reigned during that time died a natural death. 26% made it. I don't think I would have wanted to be an emperor. I don't know about you. The other 37 were either assassinated or they committed suicide. And so we see this just as a process here of whether it was executing Christian martyrs or encouraging or committing suicide or assassinating emperors or slaughtering gladiators. The Roman conscience didn't seem to be stirred, and I find that we also find a similar kind of thing where conscience in an area that in my regard is something that is phenomenal. I wouldn't have believed it 30 years ago about the mindset that's taken place. Are we more civilized? We've killed over 40 million babies, currently 168 per hour. With mechanisms such as chemical solutions. This is a photo of a child being killed by a second trimester saline abortion, or by the so-called partial birth abortion, where the body is delivered except for the head. Scissors are jammed into the head so that they can then use a suction catheter to remove it, and then they'll bring the body out. And this is, the fact is people do not even see, they don't even know what we're talking about when we refer to these kinds of things. And to make the matters worse, the final indignity is that they throw the bodies into garbage cans. So it's, for me, a phenomenon. Yet I find it fascinating, though, and ironic that although human fetuses are abundantly slaughtered around our country, the eggs of spotted owls and sea turtles are fiercely protected. I find that to be intriguing. In other words, consider this shift in value that marks decline, whereby some people seriously argue now that human life is less valuable than the life of certain animals. I submit for your own imagination the public outcry if someone aborted the calf of a humpback whale. What would be the outcry in that particular case? You know, we think about the Aztecs. They were viewed as savages because of their frequent practice of human sacrifice. But they and the Romans never sacrificed as we sacrifice in our own time. So this is a huge issue. Culture of death, suicide in America. For every 2 homicides in the U.S., there are 3 suicides. Every 1 hour and 45 minutes, another young person commits suicide. These have tripled since 1970 among the teenagers and youth. Television, 9.5 violent acts per hour on primetime TV, again illustrating a culture of death. We can see some 20 violent acts per hour on Saturday AM that kids can view. By age 18, a typical child then has witnessed about 200,000 acts of violence. Don't tell me this doesn't have an impact on their imaginations and their view of life. It's impossible for that to be not the case, including some 25,000 murderers by the age of 18 where they've seen this done. The effects of TV violence, I think, desensitize people, essentially. Decrease sensitivity toward their victims. I think it can also really have a growth in fearfulness, as well as being a contributor to aggressive behavior, and teach effectively that violent acts can lead to success. And I believe television's a killer of imagination. I think it's the single biggest killer of imagination, and it can kill us cooperative play. Let's go to films as well, and of course gang behavior can be associated with that. I even think about the progression of horror films, being something of a film buff myself. I remember the most frightening film I ever saw when I was a kid. Now, I'm aging myself because it came out in 1954, and I was terrified of this thing, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. In fact, I'm a Far Side fan, and Gary Larson was obviously affected by this movie too, because I created the world according to the Far Side. I took the 4,000 cartoons he did, and I pulled out maybe 300 of my favorites, and then I put them in categories, and one of them is The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I have 4 of them that just relate to this, but you know, with his fishy lips and gills, I was up all night long. But that's nothing compared to things that took place in following decades. Dracula, the Prince of Darkness in '66, kind of bumped it up a little bit. Texas Chainsaw Massacre in '74 bumps it up more. But this pales in comparison to Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984. And this isn't as grotesquely demonic as the movie Seven in 1995, and so it goes. You might be familiar with the 5 Saw films now. I don't know if you've seen, don't see them. You may have heard about, don't see them, but you may have heard of it. We're up to Saw 5 now, and they only get worse as they go. This is affecting people. And yet at the same time, Americans, young people get more addicted to entertainment that was previously inconceivable in terms of fantastic risk, and people risking their lives. In fact, the emergency rooms around America are seeing some real dramatic effects of this shift. See, Americans can be bored to death and need to be entertained in more and more extreme kinds of forms. Indeed, death can be seen as an entertainment, and certainly in Rome it was. They were bored too, and created their own version of what we'd call extreme sports, namely gladiatorial contests. And they were highly popular among the slaves and the wealthy. And what we can see as well, when you gamble with human life, it has huge impact. Now, as this image from the film Gladiator shows, they often fought wild beasts, which would maim or gore them to death. And when Emperor Titus inaugurated the Colosseum in Rome in the year 80, some 5,000 wild animals were killed in one day. The Emperor Trajan celebrated his conquest of Dacia by holding gladiatorial shows. These lasted 4 months, in which 10,000 gladiators participated. The majority of them were killed or died later from wounds incurred. 10,000 wild and domestic beasts were also killed in these shows. It's fascinating to me. Even mock naval battles, they actually would fill the Colosseum with water and have these mock naval battles where many of the people would die in front of the gloating spectators' eyes. Well, a culture of death is growing, I fear, in our country as well. And while this is certainly extreme, it illustrates something that never appeared before. These are called snuff videos. And as this website shows, the most shocking acts of violence ever captured on video, you will witness the entire acts of murder as they happen. And I suspect, again, it's even conceivable that in the future, pay-per-view TV might in fact include such a thing. I don't say that's necessarily the case, but I suspect it, because why not? And so I draw my conclusions, and I can ask myself these questions and what we can learn from the Roman Empire. What are the implications from our life? What can we learn from history? Because we need to understand history well. And we can learn from the Roman Empire, among other things, that when the floodgates of morality and law give way, the nation will simply invariably collapse. And that effectively lawlessness breeds anarchy and chaos, and it destroys the ability to live in community. As well, we can certainly learn that liberty without responsibility can be a great source of self-destruction. In fact, as we emphasize individual rights as inviolable, we de-emphasize personal duty and personal responsibility. Last time I checked, you cannot have rights without duties and freedoms without responsibilities. But you never hear people demanding their duties and their responsibilities. And so it's a very interesting, you can only sustain that for so long because it collectively threatens our overall well-being and freedom. And finally, our excesses are just as dangerous and extreme as Rome's if we leave them unchecked. And there is the question before us, where might we head? Because we're living in denial of basic history if we suppose that our excesses could not lead to our own destruction. What makes us suppose that ours is the only civilization that would not undergo the process of birth, growth, decay, and then death? We've seen it again and again. And so we see then that these are processes. And in our own country, we saw in the 1700s a bondage which took place during our dependency upon the British Empire, a spiritual faith that was absolutely stellar that occurred during the First and Second Great Awakenings in 1734 to 35, and then again in 1740 to 42. It had profound impact. You might not know, but that the number of people who attended church in the 18th century was lower than it is now. But these awakenings had a profound impact. Another component was a growing courage that led to the challenge of this bondage, and ultimately, not long after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we were liberated from the British rule. In the years that followed, Industrial Revolution, greater affluence, robber barons, and so forth, led to a tremendous growth of affluence which continues to the present time. And after the Second World War, it was intriguing because there was kind of a contented self-satisfaction and growing materialism. And the moral consensus began to erode. From the 1980s to the present time, we can say that there's something of a growing apathy, and I think a present process will be, and continue to grow, a growing dependence, which upon the state to provide for what Francis Schaeffer used to call personal peace and affluence. And so I want to chat about that with you right now and just make some, see what kind of thoughts you might have. I suspect when we go back to that whole idea of moving from basically the point at which we were moving toward dependence, what can bring us to bondage is one possibility. I'm not predicting this. Please understand. I'm not being a prophet here. I'm just trying to think through patterns and processes. The metrics are not good for our country, financially and so forth. There are some new trends that have been seen before, and there are global implications that transcend anything we've seen before as well, vis-a-vis economy. Now, I want to suggest, first of all, that suppose we do run into a tough go, whether it's, no one knows, is it going to be a year, 2 years, 3 years, are we going to bounce back? What will happen? No one can say. Let me suggest that you go back to 9/11 for a moment with me. What happened in 9/11, among other things? What phenomenon occurred soon after 9/11? Churches. Suddenly the churches were filled to capacity, and people got very spiritual very quickly. Did they not? Oh, for about 2 weeks. And after that, business as usual. It's almost like saying, nervously, I got the wheel now, thanks God, and I continue to drive on. That's because it was an event, not a process. Suppose, however, we went into a protracted process rather than an event of painful economic conditions. I suspect what will happen will be something very profound, and it'll lead in two directions. Because when these kinds of things occur, What will take place is people will look to some salvation, some deliverance. Paul said to the Romans in chapter 5 that we rejoice in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance proven character, and proven character hope. And hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. And if you compare that with James's word in James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, where he talks about rejoicing, not because we're spiritual masochists in these trials, but rather because they produce endurance. And then that leads to maturity and character. So the idea that God knows that in a fallen world, it'll often be the kinds of things that are painful that will get our attention and drive us away from the kind of false hopes that we may have embraced. Remember what C.S. Lewis, how he put it in The Problem of Pain? That God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our conscience, and he shouts to us in our pain. And because God has ordained human existence such that the purpose of our existence on this planet is not happiness, but holiness, that he's much more concerned about our character than he is about our comfort. He will do whatever he needs to do in his severe mercies to wake up a dying body of believers who need to wake up from the fact that they may have been seduced by the same kind of materialistic and greedy pulls that everyone else was, only with a Christian veneer. And that's why I say it's very dangerous when we, in fact, compartmentalize in our lives. But the fact is that it's easy for us to try to play by two sets of rules. Tribulation will clarify your hope and show if your hope is something that's either an ill-founded hope or a misplaced hope. It'll reveal that. But it'll also do something else. If a person doesn't turn to God, they'll turn to government in those kinds of times. They will turn to a Savior. You need to understand that. There's going to, when times get that tough, you've got to turn to one or to the other. And so you're going to have this duality that's going to go on. I think there's going to be a real revival that can happen in our country. As a consequence, if this experience lasts as long as I suspect it will, and I'm not a prognosticator, but if it lasts as long as I suspect it will, and is as painful as I think it will be, then people who are followers of Jesus may actually be revolutionized by the realization that they were trying to play by two sets of rules, and that they'll come to the understanding that they were, in fact, compartmentalizing the relationship with Jesus as only one component of their life and never made that connected with their work, with their finances, with their relationships. Somehow they bought the lie of the sacred versus the secular, that false dichotomy, and thereby lived lives of compromise, lives of inadequacy, lives of weakness, of spiritual decrepitude. And I'm suggesting that God's severe mercy can sometimes be to grip us in such a way that we wake up to that reality and it draws us back to him. Should such a revival take place, we do not know the extent to which it would have an impact on our culture. Though obviously a lot more people, I can promise you, in the months ahead, let alone the years ahead, will be people of prayer. Am I right about that? I have a suspicion that some of you have already been praying a little bit more than you might have been. Am I correct about this? Especially when you see basically 401ks, retirement plans begin to diminish right before your agonized eyes, and beginning to wrestle with a variety of things. What do we trust in? What do we hope in? What are we pursuing? And those are issues that we need to wrestle with very, very clearly. Now, going back to what Francis Schaeffer said many years ago, he said, when people are in tough times, they will go for the one who promises personal peace and affluence and be willing to compromise freedoms to get it. You see, at the end of the day, you will become more dependent, and you'll be willing, though, to compromise your freedoms in order to gain that greater sense of comfort and the illusion. In fact, it can go back to the way Rome was with the bread and circuses phase, a growing dependence upon that. And when this happens, then, you have a downward spiral whereby it can lead to an increasingly socialized state with diminished freedoms. And this is incremental. but the process can actually be fast enough to where in one's lifetime we can see these things happening, or even quicker than that. So that these are things that could theoretically lead to, my suspicion is, to a more highly socialized state. Now, consider the fact that sources of credit have been drying up. Maybe you've noticed this as well, that people who were living until recently on home equity lines are now having a problem with that. Small business loans are drying up, as well as credit cards. Think about the exponential increase in credit card debt. Now, what's happening here is that when home equity lines become a thing of the past, or at least fewer people can live off of them, fewer people can live off small business loans, I suspect as well credit cards will be capped. And when that occurs, or if not nationalized. But the fact is that there is going to be, when you run out of that, you're forced to feed off and reduce existing assets. And so what are you going to live off of then? Most Americans don't even have savings. They're in debt. They can go into their retirement. How long will that last? And so forth. So there are going to be really painful processes that can lead, I think, to a profound vulnerability toward some kind of savior, such that it can, in fact, cause people to be willing again to compromise and to sacrifice. You remember this old story of Joseph predicting, interpreting Pharaoh's 2 dreams? Remember the dreams about the 7 ears of corn that were fat, and they were consumed by the 7 lean ears? I was fascinated by that as a kid when I read that. And then the 7 fat cows and the 7 lean cows. I love that story. I still remember it. I didn't know Jesus, but I love the story. What happened then? He wisely said, let's store up the grain so that when the 7 years of famine hit, we'll have grain. And indeed, people came. And first of all, they bought grain first year with their money. Second year, they had to sell their animals, their livestock. Then the next year, their bodies and their lands. I will not hide from my Lord that we've done this. Our money is spent, the cattle are my Lord's. There's nothing left for my Lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his fear, because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. This has happened before. We can see it even right in the scriptures. So there were 4 stages. First, they sold their assets. When they ran out of assets, another form of wealth was livestock. When they ran out of that, it was their land. And finally, they themselves became slaves and would thereby now be owned by the state. I think that we can reach a real tipping point, and we move from a free market economy. And I think that a free market economy works only properly and best when it is, in fact, engaged in a moral consensus and a moral construct. But so that just unbridled capitalism is not what we're talking about here. But we can move here with 70 years of ascendant socialism in our country. There can be a tipping market suddenly from a free market to a social market economy with increasing dependence on the state. So this is my suspicion of something that might happen. I'm not saying it will happen, it's just a guess, but certainly we've seen this before. Hitler, for example, was a powerful figure, not only in terms of charisma, but you know, he really brought about an economic transformation from the pain and agony of the Weimar Republic. He's the one who built what? The Autobahn. He built the people's car, the Volkswagen. He brought production increased and so forth. He made them into a powerful military state. And he promised certain things, personal peace and affluence. We've seen this with Stalin. We've seen this with Mao. We've seen this with Mussolini. What was his promise? I'm going to make the trains run on time. And darned if he didn't. You see, he did deliver. These people all delivered something, but there was a price to be paid for the something that the people received. Pol Pot, Idi Amin, Fidel, the Ayatollah, Suharto in Indonesia, you've seen this before. This is not a new thing. We have to learn and discern that there are patterns that can take place. I'm not saying this is going to happen to us, but it is a possible basis for a movement from dependence back to bondage. It's a possibility. Does it need to be this way? God can do all kinds of things, and I believe in the sovereignty of God, and I'm going to comment about that tomorrow in more detail about how we should live our lives. But as I see it, though, there's a parallel in Europe as well. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but even in Europe, there's a movement toward, not even in Europe, but there's a movement toward greater dependence, but of a different sort. And this is just something that I suspect. I'm just going to look at some metrics here. And this is nothing to say specifically about the ideology here as being good or bad. I think that Islam can bring about a moral stability in the context, but indigenous Europeans versus European Muslims were brought in because of the need for labor, cheap labor, was partly because of a diminishing population in Europe. And it's unarguable that there is a much older population in Europe and a much younger population among the European Muslims, and furthermore, that the indigenous Europeans have a very weak ideology, whereas a far more passionate ideology in the Muslim community. Now, if we just do the math with the fertility rates, the replacement birth rate, just replacement, is 2.1 children per woman. The comparison's interesting. Sweden's 1.64. Some of these other countries are just phenomenally different outside of Europe. UK is 1.6, also below replacement rate. France is 1.89. Germany 1.35. Greece 1.3. Italy 1.23. Significantly. I mean, I just ate at an Italian restaurant last night. The number of actual indigenous Italians will decrease by half in one generation, at the rate they're going. Half of them. They're dying out. Just a few more decades, they'll be virtually a thing of the past. It's even worse in Spain, 1.15, dying out even faster. The average European, 1.4 in Europe, and 3.5 in the Muslim community. Partly because it's a more moderate kind of form, and so it's not as radical. But one thing you observe is this. When you lose an ideology, it has a direct impact on your birth rate. This has happened again and again. How about that? Good, yeah. That way, we won't worry about the battery. I would also say, again, it's just a question. We're not talking about speculation here. We're talking about reality, that the percentage of the population under the age of 15 is vastly different. The non-Muslims, 14% in Spain and Germany, for example, UK 18%, USA is 21% below the age of 15. And in many of these countries, it can be as much as almost 50%, and certainly in Europe, it's much, much greater than it is with the indigenous Europeans. And then the third area was the comparison of the ideology I alluded to earlier, whereby we have a loss of a Christian ideology, and one is, on the other hand, is a growth of an Islamic ideology that is transnational. So what you had as a growing ideological vacuum, but here, although I should point out, though, that there is some really good resurgence of the gospel in Europe that's been happening. There's a bright side to this as well, but still, having said that, here you have an ideology that transcends national borders and indeed is based upon a religious ethos such that you have an absolutism that at least a person will claim that regardless of what is needed to be done, it's got the approval of God. And so that makes a huge difference. If you compare those three together then, that is to say, the birth rate, if you compare the aging, and if you compare the loss of an ideology versus a strong ideology, what do you predict is going to happen 20 years from now? I mean, help me figure this one out. Is it hard to figure out that unless something significant takes place, I believe that Europe will become Islamized? And once you hit 51% of the vote, Sharia is inevitable. Sharia is Islamic law. Please bear in mind, I'm not making this stuff up. It's the whole idea that they have the Dar al-Harb, which is the house of war, versus the Dar al-Islam, which is the house of submission or surrender. And the whole vision here is that there will be jihad between, which means struggle, between the Dar al-Harb and the Dar al-Islam until the house of war is taken under the house of surrender. Then there will be peace. You see the idea? What we're dealing with then is not national but territorial as an imperative. It's just the reality. So what possible mechanism could take place whereby we could perhaps overcome this? Particularly when you have a critical mass of radical, though I would prefer to use the term people who take the Quran quite seriously. That really what you have here is I think a future trend that can take place, that will take place unless something very dramatic occurs. And indeed, there is a disproportionate Islamic influence relative to the percentage of the population because of their passion and because they have an ideology and they're willing to die for something. They're willing to live for something. And it's my suspicion that one mechanism, I'm not saying this is the only way, but a possible response would be a dictatorship or a totalitarian condition in which we say we're going to stop the process. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I'm suggesting that it is a possibility. But I would invite you to tell me another way in which that Islamization process will stop. Another way could be a radical spiritual revival. Other than that, though, we have different causes, but a similar potential outcome in these two conditions. Now, given that, I've got to give you a biblical perspective tomorrow. So I'm saving the best for tomorrow, because this is the meat. Everything builds up to this. I want you to understand your times. You need to, like the men of Issachar, you need to understand your times, and you need to know what you're called to do. You need to know your culture, and you need to know your calling. And you embed your calling within an understanding of your culture so that your life has power, force, dynamism, resolve, passion, commitment to Christ, and a vibrancy of your faith, which I believe can bring us together closer to Him and closer to one another than ever before. So with that, we will see you tomorrow. Oz will be doing the first two sessions, and then he and I will jointly do the third session tomorrow.